So I've made a couple of 3D first-person games in the past, but they were made in Unity, which is a game engine which does a lot of stuff for you. But today, I'm not going to use a game engine. I'm going to be building a first-person shooter completely from scratch in C++ and OpenGL. First I had to set up a new C++ project, which was relatively simple. After I got the project set up with CMake, I started to think about the architecture of my engine. And I want the engine to have an entity component system. And if you don't know what that means, it basically just means that we have entities, which are IDs. We can attach components to these entities, which are just data. And we can make systems to loop over entities with specific components. It's very fast and very efficient and also organizes data very cleanly, which is why I'll be using it. I implemented a basic entity component system in the ecs.h file of the engine, following this amazing article online. We now have a scene which holds all the entities, and we can create entities and add components, which are structs to them. I also have a little scene view here which can loop over all the entities in a scene with certain components. But with all the boring foundation stuff set aside, let's get into rendering. I'll be using OpenGL for the rendering here because it's pretty much the only graphics API I've used and I'm too lazy to learn anything else. I'll be using GLAD, which is an OpenGL loader, and glfw, which is a windowing library to get the window up and running. And just with a little bit of code, we have our first window. This window is going to be a blank canvas to put our beautiful graphics onto. But the window is just black at the moment because, well, I haven't rendered anything to the window. And so instead of rendering a triangle or a square or any other basic primitive, I decided to render a whole 3D model. And for this, I'll need to import a 3D model, but this is quite hard and difficult, so I used the async library to do exactly that. I tried to make it work, and the first attempt didn't look too great. Then I tampered a bit with the code, and eventually it worked. And we now have a car in the scene. Wait, where's it going? I don't really know where that car's headed to. Now that I have rendering done, the obvious next step is physics. Any respectable good 3D game needs physics, but the thing is, I'm dumb and I don't know a single thing about physics and I never really paid much attention in school. Therefore, I just used an existing physics engine which was Jolt Physics. It's pretty good and it works well. It was also the physics engine for Horizon Forbidden West. I got rid of the car and switched the scene out for a box and a ground. Then I quickly slapped together an integration of Jolt into the engine and look at that. Beautiful. So the lesson learned here is don't do school and copy other people's work. I also made a little tool to render the rigid bodies so I actually know where the colliders are, because that's going to be pretty important. Then I added a beam, which is going to be the player. I don't really know what happened here. I must have been on some pretty hard stuff when I made this. And with the physics done and the rendering done, I started on what any good 3D engine needs: lighting. In the engine, I'm gonna have real-time lighting and shadow casting. And the shadows are gonna work like this. We take 6 snapshots of all around the light source, and then we take the depth values of each of these textures and store them in a cube map called the depth cube map. And using this map, we can calculate whether a point is in shadow or not. It's a whole bunch of calculations and math, but with all that aside, we have working shadows now. This may look easy when condensed down like this, but this took me days to figure out, and you could not believe my joy when it finally worked. And then I just messed around with some shader effects. This is one that makes everything look really grainy. It's also running at 2 frames per second because my laptop is just an absolute potato. Here's one that makes everything look really droopy. It looks like you're having a stroke or something. I really like this effect. It adds chromatic aberration, which looks super cool. I'll probably use this for some potion effect or something. The rendering looks really cartoony at the minute because there's no smoothing in the shadows. It's either you're in shadow or you're not. To make it a bit more realistic, I added some fog lighting, following this tutorial on OpenGL.com, and the lighting looks much better now. Also, I left out specular highlights, definitely not because I'm lazy or anything, but I just don't think my game style is going to need them. But one thing I am going to need is animations. You know, for the enemies. And for doing this, I again followed this brilliant tutorial on OpenGL.com, which details on how to get skeletal animation working inside ASIMP. And the first attempt didn't work out very well, but after polishing up a few knickknacks... Wait, where is he? Oh, there he is. And after getting the skeletal animation working, I pretty much had all the tools I was going to need to make the first-person shooter game, which I think I forgot about a while ago. So it's time to actually work on the game. And the first thing I needed to add was player movement, so you could actually move around the scene. And so I quickly threw together an implementation of movement which feels very good because there's a force in the direction you walk, and this gets opposed by drag, which makes the movement feel very snappy. But there's one thing that's sorely missing here: a gun. So I whipped up a model of a gun in Blender, which was totally not inspired by anything, completely original. I then imported it into the game, which was surprisingly easy to do, and I'm kind of shocked by this because anything like code immediately breaks within 2 seconds. But the gun isn't all that useful here sitting out in the open. It needs to follow the camera, and for doing that I would need to compute the inverse of the camera's view matrix. The reason for why this is done is because the inverse of any matrix cancels the original matrix's transformation. And so when you transform the gun's model matrix with the inverse of the camera's view matrix, it won't matter where the camera's looking. The gun will always be in view. The gun now sits in the hands of the player, and I also added a little texture on top of it. After this, I swapped out the floor for one that better fits the vibe I'm going for, and also added an orange light, which follows the player. I did this to emulate the vibe of Devil Daggers, which is a really good game that you should play. Also, the tile model is ripped straight from Devil Daggers, but don't tell anyone that, alright? I then made a quick little animation for the gun and got some bullets spawning out of the barrel. But the bullets don't really behave like they do in real life, so I got the shooting functionality to work by spawning in a bunch of bullets at the barrel, applying a force of the camera's front vector, and then randomizing the force so they don't all end up in one line. Also, I added rigid bodies to them so they have physics and can play around with the geometry of the level. A crucial part of most video games is sound, so I had to get that up and running in the engine. For this, I decided to use the OpenGL library, which is pretty much just OpenGL but for sound, and quickly got sound up and running without much hassle. I also added this little guy. He doesn't do much currently, but he's actually an enemy, and when you kill him, he dies. I added bullet collision detection, which took way too long for me to add. He doesn't really look much like an enemy right now, so I went on Sketchfab and browsed some models until I came across this one. It's pretty good and also has a low poly count. And he seems to be a bit down currently. Next I rigged him up and animated him in Blender. Then I flipped him upright and got him animating properly. So you can shoot him and he'll come at you. But the game is just a bit boring right now since there's no consequence for anything. And I added what I had to add: death. I made it so you have 3 health, and when your health reaches 0, the game just crashes, which gives you a good incentive to not die. And fighting just 1 enemy is pretty lame, and you know what's better than 1 enemy? More than 1 enemy. I just made a spawner that spawns enemies after a set amount of time. And with that, the game is pretty much done. It's very simple and very janky and very broken, but it's mine. And that's what matters. I learned a lot from this experience, and hopefully you enjoy the video. I also made this little particle system while writing the script. It looks really cool and, well, bye.